It is an incredible pleasure to be here, and I feel quite privileged to get to speak to you guys this morning. As you can see from the slide, my talk today is about design is about relationships. And I think one way to illustrate this is to tell the story of how I actually ended up here. Bear with me, it's tracing back a little ways. A handful of years ago, I was doing some work for a small startup in San Diego, and ran into someone that I'd been meeting at a few different local meetups, Refresh San Diego, and his name is Heaton Shaw, and great guy, runs Kissmetrics, if you guys are aware of Kissmetrics. And he introduced me to another guy named Tim Young, who was just starting a company called Socialcast. And at the time, he was really looking for someone to come in as the director of user experience. Tiny team. We were all distributed around the country, and it was quite interesting to try and do any sort of UX work remotely. So eventually, we actually moved the whole team in the company up to San Francisco. Had the privilege of contacting Mr. Josh Porter, Bacardo, on Twitter, and we contracted him to do a little bit of work. And in that time, Josh and I got to know each other, we're hanging out, a lot of really great ideas. And one day we were bantering back and forth on Twitter about 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. If you don't know that book, go look it up, order it today, and you can thank me later. It's fantastic. And actually, for me, it was the thing that kind of like inspired 52 Weeks of UX, because I was super in the middle of day in and day out, how do I apply this, how do I do this? And I kept thinking to myself, man, I sure wish somebody had told me these things. And so Josh and I had this conversation. We started 52 Weeks of UX. Fast forward a little further to Brooklyn Beta last year, walking down the sidewalk to go get a pint of beer at the Brooklyn Inn, and walking with this guy, Gordon Paper. I don't know, do you guys know Gordon at all? Andy, good on paper. And we're chatting as we're walking down the street, and he stops and he says, "Oh, you're 52 Weeks of UX, Josh Brewer," which I find to be a very strange, prefix for my name, but nonetheless, he was like, "I love that site." I was like, "Yay, I'm glad to hear that." Fast forward, a lot of beers later, and we've talked about everything from publishing traditional print and newspapers, and all the way up to where we're headed with, EPUB and just everything that's kind of coalescing right now. And when Andy reached out to me and said, "Would you like to come and speak at Build?" I thought, man, I would love to do that. And the reason why is because I absolutely believe, without any question, that design at its very core is all about relationships. Relationships in the physical sense, relationships in the aesthetic sense. And so today I'm going to dive in and we're going to talk about relationships. Design, as a noun, is a drawing or a plan produced to show the look and function or working of a building, garment, or other object before it is built or made. If you want to head to the verb to design, it's to decide upon the look and function of a building, garment, or other object, typically by making a drawing of it. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that actually doesn't describe what I do at all. Well, I mean, sometimes, and I sketch on paper, but what is design? What do you guys consider design? Anyone out there in the audience? You want to offer up an answer? Thinking. Anybody else? Solutions to problems.
Aesthetics.
Tension. Intention. Also tension. Aesthetics. Okay. These are great. I was quite fortunate because just last week, Mueller Brockman actually asked this on Twitter. And I thought that is so perfect and very serendipitous, as the standardistas were reminding us to pay attention to. What is it? There's a bunch of answers that got retweeted right away, and I thought I'd just collect a few of them. Rethinking our experience. It's innovation and communication. It's the manipulation of form and content. Design is value. Design is a dialogue. It's philosophy arriving at elegance. I thought that was That was actually probably the most unique one of all the ones that came through. It's giving order and context to content. It's solving a problem, and my absolute favorite, I just don't know anymore. And actually, what was funny about this is it struck me because we talk about design and we use it actually in a fairly, in a multitude of ways. And I don't know how many of you guys in the room call yourselves designers, or if you call yourselves web designers, or what label you happen to attach this week to, what you do. I've gone with designer for quite a while, and I'm quite happy with that because it encompasses the totality of all the things that we do as people who practice solving problems, creating solutions, and creating experiences for people. But one of my favorites is from Herbert Simon, who was a pretty famous professor from Carnegie Mellon and maybe one of the foremost social scientists in the last century. He said, design is devising course of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. I actually really like that a lot. I like that concept of changing existing situations into preferred ones. Recently, we were at Brooklyn Beta 2, 3 weeks ago, I guess, and Cameron and Chris, who run that conference, were actually really, I think, without perhaps knowing it, hitting on this exact theme. And the idea behind it is that as designers, we have this incredible ability to change things for good. We also have the ability to do very bad things, but I prefer to focus on changing problems into solutions and creating ways to help people actually solve their problems day in and day out. My favorite, however, and what was the emphasis for this talk, was from Paul Rand. And he said design is relationships. There was a little book called Conversation with Students. If you haven't read it, again, totally recommend this. I reread this periodically, and you sit and it's almost like sitting in the room with Paul. I never met him. I wish that I had. He seems like a very, very interesting character. And the tone that he delivers, these conversations that are captured in this book, and there's countless stories about him. He's a very confident man in that he believed fundamentally that he could arrive at a solution that was the absolute answer for what you had tasked him with. And if we dig into the definition of a relationship, it's the way that two or more concepts, objects, or people are connected. It's the state of being connected. And it was interesting, the standardistas mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and right below that beautiful pyramid that they were emphasizing us focusing on is belongingness or connectedness. It's that deep, deep need in humans to feel connected to one another. And the more that I do this, the longer I'm in this profession, the more I talk with you guys, and constantly, conversations keep unfolding. We want to be connected. And we have this incredible privilege of living in an age where we're more connected than anyone has ever been in the history of the planet. In all of civilization, no people have ever had a shorter distance between one another than we do today. We have cell phones, we have telephones, we've got the internet, we've got all these means by which we're connected. And design is an expression of that relationship. It is also another definition from, I think this one is from Webster, is a connection, association, or involvement, an emotional or other connection between people. And this I love. I think that Aaron Walters has been talking about this quite a bit, and his new book, I highly recommend you pick that up as well. Notice all these book plugs. I wasn't planning on that. But reading is awesome, and I think is a huge part of what these guys were talking about earlier in the journey. But this emotional connection is so fundamental to what we do as designers. Whether you are on the side of the fence that's hardcore about data and analytics and A/B testing to prove your theories, or if you're on the other end of it where you're completely gut-driven and instinctual about what the right solution is, the reality comes down to there's an emotional response that we have as humans that to anything that's presented to us, and if we understand this, it gives us the ability to actually take strategic steps to optimize for the right type of emotional situation in order to achieve the right response. Paul Rand also talked about design being a relationship between form and content. How many of you guys have heard of the CSS Zen Garden? Yes? That is a great number of hands. I've always wanted to publicly thank Dave for doing this, so thank you, Dave, if you ever see this or hear about this. This was one of the first things that I remember that moment of like, wow, well-structured content and this separation of this other layer where I can actually take it and I can present this 10 different ways. And I actually could create 10 different emotional responses, 10 different experiences on the exact same content. Here's another one. Horizontally scrolled. I literally remember the day this one came up. Invasion of the body switchers. I don't know if you guys remember any of these, but it was proof, and it was proof to the world in a lot of ways. I remember sitting with clients and talking about web standards at that point in time and pulling up CSS Zen Garden in order to show them, look what we can do if we structure this correctly, if we pay attention to the content. If in a year you really want to change the look and feel and, purple's the new color for your company, we can take care of that. It was one of those moments of like form and content and the practical application of how we can address that. How many of you guys are aware of the Lost Worlds Fair? A lot, no? Earlier this year, I think it was, the folks over at Internet Explorer contacted Jason Santa Maria and proposed a project that would highlight the new features that were coming out in IE9, specifically the web font stuff and some of the other CSS3 features. And I thought it was pretty amazing. These, Naz Hamid, Frank Chimero, and Jason did 3 outstanding just test cases. Not like technically real content, it was all created for the purpose, but each one of these examples showed the depth that you could do and how you could basically take something that traditionally would have been one giant flattened image. And instead, this was all done using current best practices on the web. For me, when these guys put this thing up, I thought, wow, we are taking a giant step forward. The technology is coming to the place where we can actually do the things we want to do. We can see it scale. It can become responsive. It can take us from the moon all the way to the earth. It can take us on adventures. And if you haven't played with this one, make sure you do, because the little guy goes all the way down. However, on my slide, I'm just using the magic move tool, which is awesome in Keynote, FYI. But you see this great branding for Atlantis. These moments of kind of silliness and delight, and the sharks. The welcome sign. It's building up anticipation. You're moving through this whole universe. It's creating there's a very tangible emotional response the first time you play with this. 10, 9, 8, and there's anticipation. What is going to be at the bottom of this? It's a beautiful, beautiful example of taking content and the form expressing it in a beautiful way. Flipboard is another example that I would consider doing some really great things with content that's coming through, normally delivered in 140 characters and being repurposed, restyled in a fashion that's very aesthetically pleasing and exciting to spend time with. Design is also a system of proportions, which means the relationship of sizes. And the golden ratio is probably the most obvious example of this. It's a classic formula, and it's seen everything from ancient Greek, sculpture, architectural design, even growth pattern of plants and shelled creatures. I mean, we see this everywhere. We're pre-programmed as humans to respond to this particular ratio. You see it here. You see it here. People get really obsessed and they see it here. We, not by coincidence, planned it here. One of the interesting things, this is new Twitter, which is about a year and some change old now. And when new Twitter was first rolled out to the world, we had this new concept of a details pane. And the details pane was this perfect symmetry with the tweets and the detail. And it gave this beautiful balance. It was awesome. I remember sitting with Doug when he was pointing out that it actually was exactly the right ratio. And right down to the alignment of the dashboard column. What was interesting is, if you remember new Twitter, the dashboard is actually kind of a bit wider if you had a wider monitor. And so it was because there was an internal struggle, because some folks wanted the media to be bigger. And so that means we should have a bigger dashboard. So in a strange attempt at responsiveness, the dashboard actually went from this proportion to almost the exact same width as the main content area, which did two really interesting things. It left the page feeling a little unbalanced. And we actually heard a lot of people come to, emailed and whatnot into customer support just saying, I'm not quite, something's a little off, and because there was so much space over there, the hierarchy in that sign column was a little bit of a mess. And so we took some steps earlier this year to address that, brought it back down to the correct proportion, and it was interesting to just watch comments come through Twitter of oh wow, it just feels better. And there's not really a tangible metric you can put on it just feels better, except maybe that's part of the metrics of a successful design, right? How big was the smile on your face when you used this thing, right? And maybe one day we'll have crazy sensors built into our computers so that we can measure how big the smile was on your face. But it was an awesome moment for me because I'm a big fan of the golden ratio, and I actually think that whenever you can utilize it and it's appropriate, it's a fantastic device that you can almost guarantee human beings will respond and resonate to. Another example is Tim Brown's modular scale from last year, where he took the example of a fixed font size and applied the golden ratio to it above and below in order to create a modular scale of proportion for your type. And he typeset a couple of examples, and you can just see there's this beautiful balance in this entire screen. All because he understood design is about relationships. It's about the proportion and the ratio and the relationship of the type sizes. Back in 2007, Mark Bolton wrote an article about incremental letting, and it was one of those moments where I was like, yes, duh, that makes sense. Do it in print, why wouldn't we do it on the web? And it's just simply a proportion. It's 5:4. Every 5 lines of the small text, supporting text, matches up to 4 lines of regular text on the baseline. And whenever you use these types of relationships and these types of proportions and systems, you find your design instantly falls into a balance. By no means am I saying that it solves all of your problems for you, but it's going to take you a long way down the road into having a sense, or a more holistic sense of proportion in your design. And choosing the right typeface for any project, to me, is this kind of, this idea of the relationship there. The relationship between the tone of the content and the actual right typeface for the experience. So I thought I would show you an example of what you should not do. Some things just don't call for Comic Sans. I would actually argue most things do not call for Comic Sans. But could you imagine the relationship this typeface has with this content is so at odds that you couldn't even get your head around it if you wanted to. The New York Times actually has a beautiful, beautiful, type on the site, and it does a great job of respecting the content itself that's there. Graham Smith stumbled onto this old VW sketch for the logo, and I saw this a little while ago, and to me it was just one more amazing example of proportions. Look down in the bottom corner, and you've got these mappings of percentages that relate the whole thing together. It wasn't that somebody just took a V and a W and slapped them together and stuck a circle on it, right? Like, this didn't happen by accident. There was an absolutely calculated method to the relationship of these sizes and the gaps and the angles at which, they put this together. You can see it again even with the way that they're referencing how the branding and how the word mark or logo should actually be used in public and in print. My next example is a very interesting little story. This is not philanthropo. This is philanthropoo. And for those of you who don't know about philanthropoo, it was a small little company that myself and two other guys put together because we wanted to do something about raising awareness of sanitary issues in third world countries. So at South by Southwest this last year, we launched World Poopin' Day, along with water.org and a few other sponsors, because we wanted to try and raise money. And so we set up a site, and basically if you signed up, you gave us access to poop in your account once, only once, on this day. And the volume of tweets that we were able to generate, we were able to raise some cash because people pledged to, if we got a certain amount. The interesting thing was, when I was starting to work with the branding for this a little bit, it was actually the O that helped me come up with an actual design. And it was amazing because I had gone through a bunch of different typefaces, but for some reason I looked at that O on the end of this and I went, oh, that's it. And I immediately had it done, showed it to the other guys, and they were like, that's it. That's exactly it. Funny side story, we were in Austin for South by Southwest, and furthering this idea of relationship, we had a dinner with all the people who had been involved, the water.org's folks, the Co-Tweet guys, and I ended up sitting next to Patricia Arquette, who is an actress, and she's deeply, deeply involved in the relief effort in Haiti. And I'm sitting there next to her, and she's telling me about these trips that she's taking down to Haiti. And this woman's life has completely, shifted 180 degrees. She was in Hollywood doing movies and TV shows and all this stuff, and all of a sudden the thing happened in Haiti and she dropped everything. And she went, and there were people that she had connections with, relationships, that opened the door for her to be able to set up a foundation to get things going. She went down and was living with these people in the tents, in the aftermath of this wreckage, and there was story after story after story of a little connection here. The ability to tweet to someone on the other side of the island, connecting lost children with parents through SMS messages and all these things. And to me, it's this incredible example of relationship on multiple levels in what we're doing with our design. So the next kind of level of design being about relationships really comes down to these three things: people, content, and devices. And right now, we are in the midst of probably one of the biggest shifts that I think I can remember. It may be even rivaling the initial wave of personal computers. There are nearly 7 billion people in the world. 77% of them are mobile subscribers. Kids have cell phones. Folks out in the sub-Saharan Africa, Japan, kids are on the train, monks. There's all these folks that are using mobile devices. Twitter's got over 100 million active users. Facebook's got over 8 million active users. 35% of American adults own a smartphone. And I'm going to go through some statistics here, but it's all to reinforce this idea that we're in the midst of this incredible shift, and it all revolves around the people, the content, and the devices. So, nearly 44% of active users on Facebook access it through their mobile device. Over 55% access Twitter through their mobile. This is an interesting one. This big giant blue line on the chart is the iPad's first 3 quarters of sales. in comparison to the kind of reddish one, which is the iPhone, and the iPod is the measly little green one at the bottom. This should give you some sort of reference for the scale at which this adoption of kind of the more mobile, on the go and not necessarily sitting in front of a computer type of experience that we're shifting into. On the content side of things, Facebook has over 250 million photos uploaded every day. That is a massive amount of data. 30 billion pieces of content produced each month. On Twitter, there's 5 billion tweets every 5 days, and somewhere around 25% of those have links to other content. This was an interesting one. I actually had no idea that Tumblr had grown this much, but 12.4 billion total posts on Tumblr alone. That's an astronomical figure. 33.6 million blogs. This I pulled this morning. There was 42 million roughly posts just today. And when you really get down to it, 70% of people using social networks mobily have posted a status update on their device. What does this mean? It means that we're seeing this giant shift away from sitting in front of a computer, and we're seeing a shift to people wanting access and demanding access to content in real time, wherever they are, whenever they want to. They also are driven to share and create that content on the fly, on the go, based on the simple premise that I have a smartphone, it should be smart. It should let me do the things I want to do wherever I am. This chart is actually from Mixi, which is one of Japan's leading social networks. And you see this massive inflection point where the green is the web logins and page views, and it's just slowly diminishing, and the mobile is just skyrocketing up. So, enough with the stats. What is the plan? I would say...
Toto? I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. Oh, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore.
Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore.
Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore.
Wake up, Toto. You're not in Kansas anymore.
Jesus, Ari, you startled me.
I definitely don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto.
I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto.
I don't think we're in the food chain anymore, Dorothy.
No, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore.
The world as we know it has changed. Period. We are in the midst of designing for a myriad of devices in a myriad of contexts with any number of bandwidth limitations. Any given point in time, you may be seeing your same content that you designed on a tiny mobile phone screen. It could be being pulled up through a web browser. It could be on a tablet. It could be on a giant screen like this. It could be on a television. Pretty soon, it's going to be in your car. This ubiquitous notion of access to this stuff is just staggering. And we really, we aren't in Kansas anymore. And whatever we thought we knew about designing for the web, in my opinion, has to be radically updated. And we're in the process of understanding and coming to, it's kind of like back at the beginning of the 2000s and the web standards thing, except like, in my opinion, an order of magnitude more intense. Back then we were just trying to stop using tables and maybe write some good CSS that's not in line. And here we are now dealing with mobile phones and tablets and all the different types of hardware that we were talking about and all the different pieces of content that are flowing through. Cameron Cozen, Fictive Cameron, talked about orbital content and the idea that the content that we create and that we consume really should belong with us, and we should be able to take it with us and repurpose it and use it and have it available in any given moment, in any context. It goes in the face of all the traditional revenue models and kind of advertising models and all these types of things, but we have to understand that this disruption will only accelerate. The quantity and diversity of connected devices, many of which we haven't even imagined yet, will explode, as will the quantity and diversity of the people around the world who use them. Our existing standards, workflows, and infrastructure won't hold up. This is a little quote from the future-friendly, I call it a manifesto. I don't know exactly what they would call it. If you haven't had a chance, take a look at future-friendly. It's a group of people who actually all were focused on kind of mobile first and where we're headed with this stuff. And they went and basically rented a house in the woods in Tennessee, I believe, for a long weekend, and came away with this basically call to arms that is, to me, kind of a signal point for us in this moment and in our generation, and shifting what it means to design for the web. Dieter Rams once said, "Good designers must always be avant-gardists, always one step ahead of the times. They should and must question everything generally thought to be obvious. They must have an intuition for people's changing attitudes, for the reality in which they live, for their dreams, their desires, their worries, their needs, their living habits. They must also be able to assess realistically the opportunities and bounds of technology." That's something that I could see printed up and hung on a wall in just about every studio that's working on the web today. Skip through that one. This was actually 2 days ago as well. Serendipity. I kept stumbling on these things going through my Twitter feed. I'm like, hey, that's perfect. We should use that. In the era of new devices, platforms, not designing pages, we're designing systems of content relationships, flexible content. Again, it keeps coming back to this idea that things are related, there's relationships between things. Mark Bolton, in the last year, has been talking about this idea of content out, and talking about not being fixed to a 960 grid that gives you basically containers to pour your stuff into. I thought about trying to give you an example by pouring water into a cup and having it spill all over the place, but I figured Andy would be less than thrilled with that. But the idea is we keep trying to stuff the content we have into containers because we've got predefined fixed grids that are based off of either maybe a framework, or maybe there was actually a choice as to why your grid system was the way it was, if you're using one. But what Mark's advocating for is this connectedness. It's a feeling of belonging, going back to what we talked about before. We do that by defining the constraint from your content. The constraint could be arrived at from an advertising unit, or from a thumbnail image, from tons of legacy content. Whatever it is, start there. Don't start from an imaginary page. And this gets to the idea that as more and more devices, more and more screens, more and more different inputs receive this content, we need something to anchor it to. We need a relationship. We need the anchor of a relationship. And I think that it is not easy. It's a lot easier to try and just shove stuff into a pre-existing box. But when you begin to think in terms of relationship between the content you're working with, between the pieces of clay, as it were, you begin to see the freedom that it allows. It actually allows for things to be more fluid and more flexible, and it actually is a giant step forward in the idea of responsive web design, in my opinion. I thought about Instagram. They created one constraint that allowed them to make their product dead simple, and it avoided the problem of landscape versus portrait photos. One simple constraint. The relationship of their content would always be that it was a square, and that any time you saw it, you would know that's an Instagram photo. That was Instagrammed, right? These are just a smattering of pictures I've posted recently. I love this. They have no web interface yet, but I imagine that when they decide to go into that, that foray into that realm, they're going to have a ton that they can do because they have one fixed constraint by which they can base everything else off of, and they can allow things to evolve and be more fluid. And I actually just look forward to giant walls of photos of my children and beer. The other really interesting thing that's happening is the connection with the tools. And when I say tools, traditionally you had carpenters who used their planer and the chisel and these things, and they were literally an extension of themselves. They were the means by which they imbued their personality into the furniture and the craft work, the detail, the finesse. And it's interesting, I think today we've got our own set of tools. And it's really mind-blowing to me that this device, this thing that literally has become an extension of ourselves, I don't know about you guys, how many in this room have a mobile phone? Smartphone. How many iPhones? Androids? Someone has to be developing for Android. It's good. And designing for it. I have a Windows phone. You have a Windows phone? Yes. All right. I should have asked. I'm sorry. But it's amazing to me. This is an extension of ourselves. I watched my parents, my brother, my sister, my wife, all get an iPhone. And pretty soon behaviors started to emerge. Creation of things happened. Where before, a phone was a phone because you needed to call someone, or maybe text message someone. And then all of a sudden, this comes along and changes the entire way that millions and millions and millions of people are going about their daily lives. For the majority of us, I'm sure, you're posting messages to Facebook or to Twitter or to any number of other places all the time. You're creating things. You're also consuming. You've got this on the go wherever you are. I don't know about you. I use plain text, and it's a simple text app. It syncs with Dropbox. It does all these great little things. It allows me to write stuff on the fly that's then, pushed over to another place where I can edit it later. Instagramming photos all the time. It just blows me away the amount of creative capability we have in our hands. And how many of you guys, actually just as a quick survey, how many of you guys have never changed your background on your phone? One. I've got 2 people in the room. Super interesting. How many of you guys don't have a case on your phone? You like the lines? Yeah. I'm the same way. To me, the fact that 2 people in this entire room haven't customized this in some way says a lot. It's an expression. It's part of us, whether we like it or not. There's good and bad to that. I mean, how many of you guys have seen this lately? So, what do you think of my talks like this? And yeah, we're totally. How's the wife and kids, Chris? Yeah. Yeah, it's not awesome, right? But great power, great responsibility. The whole bit. One thing that was really interesting to me was just in studying Apple and their branding and kind of their advertising model, you see a lot of this. You got happy, smiling faces. You got people doing fun stuff, and somebody's capturing this moment. Oh my goodness. Whereas before, in my parents' generation, I don't have Super 8 videos of myself at 3 years old. I have a handful of photos that are stuck to some weird plastic laminate thing that you can never get out and no way, shape, or form save. My kids are going to have a detailed summary of their life from day one. It's actually changing memory. I actually expect that my kids will be able to recall things earlier than any of us ever were, simply because they go back and my daughter, she loves it. Just put on iPhoto, Daddy. Just put it up. She loves to watch the progression in time. Oh, Dad, that's when we went here. And you're like, how do you remember that? And then when we go to that place, oh, Dad, this is the time. Remember when we were here last time? And it just mind-boggling. Anyways, back to Apple's advertising. Then you get to something like Droid, a bare-knuckle bucket of duds, and Terminator, apparently. And if your name is Sarah Connor, you should be afraid. But it is interesting, going back, now look at the contrast here. This is all about people. It's all about people. And this brings me to the last kind of section of this talk is the web is honestly being rebuilt around people. Paul Adams said this a little while ago, and to me, this is the most powerful and important part of this whole thing, is that at the end of the day, we're designing for people. We're creating things for people. There's a level of compassion that's absolutely essential to working in this field. A good friend of mine helped found CoTweet, and he was the design lead there. His name's Kyle Sullenberger. And Kyle did something very interesting. He, because it was a small team, took over the responsibilities of customer service. And Kyle will tell you, if you ask him how was the design process that you went through at CoTweet, and he will always talk about how important this moment of consumer and customer relations was to informing his design process. It put him in touch. It let him actually feel connected to the people using the thing he was working on creating. Another example is empathy. And I have a friend who's working on a couple of projects in the healthcare space. And he is not diabetic, but he's working on a product that is for diabetics. And he's taking his own glucose every day. He's trying to come to understand the situation, the emotion, the frustration, the actual amount of time in your day that's required to live with this condition. And to me, these are the kinds of things that as we begin to talk about user experience, for example, and I would actually back it up even further than that. I actually just think designing for human beings requires us to be engaged in a level of empathy and connection. And I think about Steve Jobs passing. And I don't know where you guys were, but I was sitting in the design room, our little team's room at Twitter's headquarters, when all of a sudden the news started coming up on Twitter. And there's about 5 of us in the room, and it was like someone just filled the room with weight. And no one could talk. And no one in the room had ever met Steve. No one had actually had an interaction with him. And yet all of us felt deeply connected to this person. And I genuinely felt a sense of loss in my own life. And I find that to be an absolutely staggering thing, because this is a man who put everything into creating products for people, for us, for the mainstream consumer. He wanted something that was delightful. He wanted something that would actually change the way that you lived your life and did these things. And Steve and all of his story aside, it's very hard to argue with the fact that billions of people, or millions at least, people were affected very deeply by someone's passing that they had never ever met. There's a quote from Bruno Munari that says, "Anyone who uses a properly designed object or product feels the presence of an artist who has worked for him, bettering his living conditions and encouraging him to develop his taste and sense of beauty." I want us to remember that kind of sense when we're touching code that's going to create a website. When we're actually, if you work with a physical product, know that someone else is going to touch this same thing that you're touching right now. Historically, architecture has been this great conduit of creating spaces for connection. The ancient churches were all about your connection with God, and they inspired people by their grandeur. But really what it was, at its most simple, was a place of connection. Place of connection with you and another human being, with you and your higher being. Simplicity is the other moment, or other element of design that I think is extremely crucial for us to be embracing. The hard truth is that most people don't actually want to live their lives attached to your application. They want to use it to accomplish a purpose, find a sense of satisfaction, and move on with their lives. So in my opinion, if we can do that, we actually are doing them a favor. Capture is an app that does one thing really well. It starts recording video the second you open the app, and hitting the home button closes it and stops it and saves it. This awesome little app does one thing, and it does it well, and it enabled me to capture this.
So let down your hair. Rapunzel, let down your hair.
From the top, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Cinderella, let it Rapunzel, let down your hair. Rapunzel, let down your hair. Rapunzel, let down your hair. This is just a song about Rapunzel.
So pumped.
Rapunzel, let down your hair. Rapunzel, let down your hair. Rapunzel, let down your hair. Let down your hair, Rapunzel.
I can't even begin to tell you the just pure joy I was experiencing in that moment. I immediately posted it up to Flickr, sent it out on Twitter. My wife put it up on Facebook. We had tons of friends immediately just freaking out about how awesome this was. We had 3 different people actually get a hold of us a couple days later and go, all I could do was keep singing Rapunzel, let down your head for 2 or 3 days. And here's my daughter. she's just being precocious and having fun, but I was able to pull out my phone, hit that button, and start playing with her and capture it. And these types of things are, I mean, I would pay so much money to keep this and have this, and all it took was like 1 second to start the thing. The last little thing I want to talk about is delight, and I'm going to wrap this up real quickly. My timer is different than your timer, so. Anyways, delight. Matthew Smith, Squared Eye, actually he's changed his Twitter handle. He's now Whale on Twitter. He and his team designed Blue Sky Resumes, which they were a resume builder company, pretty static, kind of like stock photo stuff, grays and blues, and you know, the kind of like traditional and Matthew said, I want to do something crazy. I want to actually design something that makes people excited and get a sense of joy and little moments of just silliness and see, and his opinion was that he believed that investing in delight would actually provide a financial return. What's amazing was the number of monthly proposals went up by 15%, the increase in clients went up by 65%, and this is the crazy one, overall revenue increased by 85%. And the company attributed it 100% to this design that went way out there. It had clouds that were kind of cute, and when you scrolled, the people's hands held onto the side, and just had these little touches and moments of whimsy. And you know what's interesting is most people don't have a lot of joy in their lives, sadly. And even a little teeny bit of joy goes a long, long way. I know it sounds silly, but these are the kind of things that we've got to remember as we're designing for people. Delight is something that provides a source of happiness. And something that provides happiness is something you will return to. And as a verb, delight, one of the definitions which I am in love with, is to hold spellbound. How many of you guys would love to have your designs cast a spell on people? So much so that they were absolutely glued to and waiting for the next thing that you would provide. It's word of mouth, it's emotional investment in a product. What this garners is favor. It garners trust. It garners respect and some admiration from people that aren't probably looking for that in their day in and day out routine. We should challenge ourselves to go beyond just not making it bad and actually make things that go beyond not being frustrating. I think that you can get a long ways by just not having things be frustrating, but to me the next step for us is to design things that bring delight to users. Some apps that just work, translation delight, cloud app, it's just dead simple. Google, I mean, as much as I may have other issues with other products, their search is amazing. Type Andy McMillan and look at what you get. Boom, that's him right there. Instapaper allows you to have content saved, accessible at any point in time. Instagram, super simple and easy. Dropbox, how many of you guys are Dropbox users? Remember life before Dropbox? Painful. Anyways, good design isn't about making decisions for your users, it's about making those decisions irrelevant. So with that, I'm going to close and just say thank you guys so much for having me here. And remember, design is all about relationships, all the way down to the humble little anchor tag. And in my opinion, href doesn't stand for hyperlink reference, it stands for human reference. There's a person on the other side of every single one of those links, and that's the point, is the connection. Thank you guys.